So we will now discuss the way forward, and I don't want to put I don't want to influence this discussion in any way at all, except to say that Dr. Swoboda, you have the word to perhaps say something about anything about the way forward for Palestine and Israel.
Let me say the first point, I think, which is a strong agreement, and that was also our work we did when I was still president of the S&D group, together with the Kreisky Forum and Leila and some others, was let's start at the rights of the people. Why is it that we accept that the people in the same region, because they are Palestinians, they have less rights than because they have Israeli, or I should say Israeli Jews, because even in Israel, the rights are not equally distributed. What kind of rights? The right to have a job, the right to travel, the right to have enough water, the right to object to decision of the Israeli government and to go to court. So I think this is the basic issue. And then we come away from this Palestinians against Israelis, pay low against the Israeli government, because this diverts from the basic issue, which is one region and the people have basically different rights. Of course, in every state you have richer people, poorer people, but not because they one are poor and the other are richer, but because the one are Palestinians and the others are Israelis, and in Israel you have that kind of differentiation. I think that is the big issue, and that we have to start and to convince our citizens that's not acceptable. It's not about politicians, about it was in past Arafat and about President Abbas. No, it's about citizens, normal people where there's a basic different right. If Prime Minister Manuel Valls in France speaks about apartheid in France between Muslim and non-Muslim population, what is happening in that region, in Israel itself or in Israel and Palestine? Now the way forward. Of course, finally you have to have also an institutional framework. And I know and I heard, and this is a normal debate about one state and two-state solution. First of all, I think you can only come to something new if the two partners, and you have two partners who have to negotiate, can negotiate on the same level, with the same basic position. Now you have a state, a government recognized by I don't know how many governments in the world, member of the United Nations and so on. On the other hand, you have an authority. How can an authority and a government have an equal position? Therefore, I'm fighting, together with others, of course, and some countries already did it, to recognize Palestine as a state. Does that mean it has to be a state forever? No, it does not. But because the borders and many other issues are open. But to recognize Palestine as a state is a precondition to have equal rights on the negotiation table. This is the first point. Secondly, what could be the outcome of negotiations from equal partner? The outcome could be one state. One state, of course, is very difficult. You know, the Jewish side has a certain perception of their Jewish state, and the Palestinians, of course, have another kind of objective, so it's not easy. Of course, I would agree, because normally in Europe we fight against any ethnic defined state. Out of the history, to say to Israel, ethnic is irrelevant, just majority will be perhaps in some years. The Palestinians in Israel is not easy to convince them. Also, I hope that this kind of insistence, we are a Jewish state, will disappear again. So we could have two states. In our booklet, which we produced, and perhaps Ketod already said something about it, if you see that maps Israel here and the Palestinian territory, you can say, how can that work as two states? It's so split up, it's so interrelated. How can it work as two states? So what could be a solution? If you have two authorities, two governments, two states in some way, but nevertheless have a federation, where you have some institutions common. Look at the European Union. Yeah, we are at different separate states. But at the end of the day, many decisions we cannot just take as we want it. For example, we have a European court. And if the European court says this is not allowed what you do, you have to change it. And if you don't, you can be punished. So in some way, why don't we, for example, start to say, it's a tricky issue. And I know the issue with the International Criminal Court. Why don't we have a joint court of human rights for Israel and Palestine, where you can appeal if you are violated against the Palestinian Authority? There are many complaints also in Palestine. It's not so easy. Or against a decision by the Israeli government. A joint joint court for human rights for these two entities. Let's call it for the moment entities. Why don't we have a joint common authority on water distribution? Because water is a big issue for certain people. Why don't we finally or not finally, but as a next step, may also have a common and joint authority on migration, internal, external, immigration, emigration, whatever. Now, everything you talk about Israel and Palestine is in some way, unrealistic. But maybe if you think it through and we would start to say it's neither one state nor two states proper, but maybe it's two states in a federation where you can think about some joint elements. There's still many things are discussed and can be decided by the two governments, but you have some joint elements, and maybe for the citizens, the most important thing is a court of human rights, where all the human rights violations can be appealed against. Because you know that some of the criticism is that even the Palestinian authorities or some of the security forces are an instrument of Israeli security policies. And against whom do you appeal if you are taken into prison by a Palestinian security apparatus more or less on push or pushed by the Israelis? Against the Palestinians or against the Israelis? Maybe a joint court would be feasible. And this is the final remark. I think you have to give the Palestinians an own authority. I think you cannot just say, okay, you will be delivered to one state. That's not possible. On the other hand, if we see that this interrelationship is so strong, we have to find a solution in between. It's what we did in European Union, of course, with another history. If you look between the wars, think about the wars in Europe, or between even Germany and France, it was also not so easy. It is much more difficult in the Palestine, and you need probably more international engagement. For example, in the security issue, you need probably at least some elements of a joint security force from Israel, from Palestine, and from European Union and the United States of America. Otherwise, it will not work. And maybe these forces from the outside will bring in, I'm not so sure about the Americans if I look what they do in Iraq, but maybe some sort of more human rights issue into it. At least I can imagine with all my criticism on Europe that Europe would do it. So I think from my personal perspective, the way forward has to be an unorthodox one. It's not a solution we find and just say, take this and that's it. And therefore, I think we should think in these terms. Maybe this is a way forward.
Much. Maybe Leila, you haven't talked for quite a while. you could react to that somehow, to what Dr. Swoboda just said.
Yeah, I think it's very, very beautiful intervention. I think, yeah, that's what the debate is when people discuss alternative to partition. It's not so much, do we have the solution just around the corner, we have a model, come and apply it. It's, as you said in a very nice way, we have to think in an orthodox way. And I also think, given the experience of Europe, there is a lot to learn from it. I think it's important that people bear in mind that, as you know very well, we cannot undo history. So what we have now, a history of a conflict that has been on for 100 years. We have a state of Israel that now is nearly 8 years, has been formed 8 years ago. We have an occupation of the West Bank and Gaza now of 50 years. We have a reality on the ground which, for all intents and purposes, is a one-state reality, with Israel being the dominant. But we also have an international recognition of a Palestinian state. So we have the acknowledgement of a Palestinian state, but we don't have the material foundation, the material possibility for an independent state. And in that respect, you can perfectly think of a model of a federated state or a multicultural state that can, or what people call the parallel states, you can incorporate these two states in a federated system. The problem, though, remains something that we did not get a chance to talk much about earlier, is the issue of power and the inequality of power. We are stuck today. We don't know. We don't have a two-state solution. We don't have a one-state solution because we have a very asymmetric power relationship. Israel has all the power and has all the immunity. That's the biggest problem. And the Palestinians have all the recognition, but don't have any power. And so long, being realistic, so long as we don't shift that power imbalance, and Europe there has a very important role to play, we will not move forward anywhere. I mean, we will be faced with a more explosive situation in a few years' time because the demographic situation will be impinging on everybody. So the way forward, I think, for me is to try and think more about what Europe can do and what the EU, the international community can do. And I think Europe can do a lot because the EU has power, has leverage. It can hold Israel accountable to the signed agreement. It can hold Israel accountable to the laws and the concept of equality of citizens, which we are defending. And I think that's feasible without worrying that Israel should not be above the law, should not be above other nations. I think that's a very practical solution, even if it will be costly politically. But I think both for the long term for Europe as well as for the region as a whole, holding Israel accountable to international law, to things it signed on, can be a very helpful way to move forward. And thirdly, I have to say, there is something else as well. We cannot bypass the principles. I mean, the earlier session talked about it. We talked about also early in the morning. There are fundamental rights that have to be protected for anybody, irrespective of their nationality, irrespective of their modality of political configuration. And as long as we have this in line, then we can do something about it. And I think I'll stop it there.
Mazen, can I ask you to also reflect on what both speakers have said so far and think about the way forward as well?
Yeah, I think many good points were made, and Leila talked about the role of Europe as what could happen or what could be done as a way forward. I'm just going to say a few comments about the possible or the way forward actually for the Palestinians, in the sense that whether it's one state or two state or 1.5 state, there's always going to be need for somebody to make the decision and mobilize for the decision. And if we look at the current situation, the current political situation, the current representation of the Palestinians, we see that the state of division, so for example, between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, each party claiming legitimacy. The PA in the West Bank, for example, actually, if you remember, today is the 10th anniversary of the election of Mahmoud Abbas. So it's been in power for 10 years so far, with one election only. The parliamentary elections, where the results were undermined, and basically there was an active attempt to undo the election. The PLO, which is actually the representative body, not the Palestinian Authority, so the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was created in 1964, which was created as the representative of the Palestinian people, and all the Palestinian parties and factions were members of this group. It has a parliament called the Palestinian National Council. So it's parliament, it's thought of as parliament in exile. And this parliament, till the 80s, was functional to the extent that a parliament in exile could function. So it wasn't a model democracy, but more or less it reflected the sentiments and also the different people. So there are people from different parts. As you know, most of the Palestinians are refugees. So people from different locations were represented, students were represented, women were represented, professions were represented, unions were represented, political parties were represented, and there were discussions there, and there were serious discussions. And some of the decisions, for example, about which vision to adopt, so the 1971 secular state was discussed there. The 1974, the 10 points plan, which is basically the beginning of discussion and acceptance of a two-state solution, also happened there. Now this institution is actually dysfunctional, to the point that it hasn't really met since the early 90s. And last time there was discussion about it, it turned out that there's 3 different lists of people who are members, and the lists don't match. So any solution, whether 1 or 2 or anything in between, has to be through representative institutions. And internally for the Palestinians is to rebuild these representative institutions, to revitalize the role of the PLO and the Palestinian National Council as a first step of devising a strategy, whatever way we go. So I think I should just going to stop here, and I guess going to be more discussion about this point.
Thank you very much. I'd like to just add another opinion of mine here, if I may, and it's about grassroots and basic democracy. That Palestinians have had elections, okay, they've had a few, but they've been fair and they've been free. The one you mentioned, Abbas's election 10 years ago, was a fair and free election according to observers. Also 2 parliamentary elections that were fair and free. Now that we have the internet and modern technology, we could organize a fair and free election for all Palestinians, for those the many refugees outside of historic Palestine, and perhaps even the Palestinian citizens of Israel. That more than just the institutions are representative, but actually that there is a sort of grassroots and basic democracy as well can be improved upon. Even though, as you said, there are a lot of really basic democratic processes at work in the Palestinian polity that are there and working and have worked very well for a long time. But there's no such society that is perfect, that the democracy can always be improved. But I'm going to stop preaching now, and I'm going to ask the floor perhaps, and next, Dr. Swoboda, you would like to perhaps respond to what's been said so far.
Well, just as one sentence, of course we need elections. I'm totally in agreement. No, you raised the question whom we should have recognized as voters, which is a very delicate issue. We know it from others, from Western Sahara and other areas. But let's first have an election in Palestine in the two areas, because I think democratic legitimacy is important. And one has to show to the West, like now in Greece, maybe the West doesn't like it, but you have to recognize the expression of the people. And then, of course, we can also think about how we can involve Palestinians outside the Palestinian or Israeli area in the different camps. So.
Okay, thank you. Then I'll ask the floor for questions. We have one over here from the UNRWA representative.
I have been working for the past 25 years for UNRWA, the UN agency for the Palestinian refugees, and I've also been writing a lot about their legal status and reflecting on sort of the search for a just and durable solution. So my question to, I think, all the panelists is, how do you see the future of the Palestinian refugee issue? One of the things that I've become more and more convinced about and aware of through my quarter of a century in the region is the centrality of the refugee issue in the quest for justice, in the quest for a resolution, a sustainable resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict. So how do you see the future of the refugee issue, and in particular your views on the quest for a just and comprehensive solution in the light of or in the framework of the evolving reality in both Israel-Palestine, as well as in the broader developments in the region? So that's my question.
And the Vienna Institute for organizing this kind of unwanted dialogues. Since Hannes Swoboda, he's free from the European Parliament, but he knows very well what is going on behind the scenes. So I wanted to ask him which conflicts he sees, why the European Parliament is not taking clearly position, obliging Israel, for example, to mark exactly the origin of its produce, which it says produce of Israel, while it's coming from occupied territories, why it is not pushing really to consequently oblige them to declare really the origin. It is cheating very much. I have photos taken a few months ago there. And so that is very important for us, because as long as the colonizer is taking advantage and profit, he will never change its mind. Only when it feels that it's more costly, it gets expensive for him, then he might change. I am a witness of my experience with Southern Africa. Apartheid seemed impossible to overcome until it became more expensive for business to continue with apartheid. And my question is really the challenge. You are no longer a member of parliament, but what can we do to push a little bit the parliamentarians, politicians to take a clear, open, courageous stand?
I'm Tariq Youssef. I'm sorry I can't stand up for a medical condition, but my name is Tariq Youssef. I work in the Egyptian embassy here in Vienna, and I used to work 4 years in Tel Aviv. I would like to thank you all for the presentations we have been hearing for the whole day. It was very elaborative, and it was very generous in the way information was widespread in it. As I see your advocacy for a one-state solution, I see you concentrating on one perspective, which how does the territory looks like. But I didn't hear anyone speaking about how mentalities of people, the Israelis and the Palestinians, are thinking about it. I heard the results of the survey that was done in the Palestinian territories. I have another conclusion from the results of this survey. Yes, they need a state. Yes, they need a passport. But this is political depression, in my opinion. This could be considered political depression. That doesn't mean that they don't need a state. You could force them for a one-state solution as a plan B instead of nothing. But that's not the issue. Of course, Israelis are looking for a Jewish homeland. They need a Jewish majority. They will not accept Palestinians coming in the territories. A one-state solution is very difficult for Israelis, to the extent that you hear several heads of parties in Israel threatening Arab Israelis that they would be having political aspiration in the Palestinian territories. Ideas of Lieberman concerning a population center swap is one of these significant things. I believe Livni in 2008 stated that clearly, that if you need political aspiration, go to the Palestinian territories. Here are your citizens. Okay, do you want political aspiration, you go there. This is a very difficult atmosphere from the perspective of how people think for this kind of solution as a one state. The one state solution, yes, it's not a new one, it's an old one, but it has been always between a narrow segment of each society. It was a very narrow segment in the Israeli society that thought about it, and a very narrow segment in the Palestinian society that thought about it. It had never popular grounds. I believe one of the Arab leaders that advocated this was the deceased President Muammar Gaddafi, and he called it Esratin as a one-state solution. Just to comment on what the participant here said, which is very, very interesting. The situation now, it's not that the two-state solution failed. No, it did not fail, yet, at least. Yes, there's settlements. Settlements is an obstacle. But there's still prospect for a state in Palestine, which is a viable state, which is connected, and it's not a Protestant, no. There's something called settlement blocks that could be exchanged. Settlement blocks are not defined in Israel till today. No one knows what's a settlement block. There's no definition to it. Yes, maybe there's a problem with the Kidumim settlement block, for example, because it's extending inside the West Bank, but it's reversible, as the Palestinian ambassador mentioned earlier. I believe the situation is a status quo, and in international relations, there's a scientist called Zartman. He talked about status quo theory. Whenever there's a conflict, and there's a status quo in this conflict, no party tends to change the situation. In order to solve this conflict, you need to have a mutually hurting status quo. Now, the status quo is not hurting anyone. Netanyahu, since 1997, has been applying something called economic peace in the West Bank, and the Israelis are not losing anything from occupation. I believe if this is moved to pressure both of them and make it mutually hurting, a two-state solution is still viable. Settlements in the Palestinian territories, they could be reversed. An exchange of land is possible with the settlement blocks. And I believe the major effort should be now, and this is what the Palestinian side is doing, is try to reach to international organizations, try to declare a state, try to make it more hurting for the Israelis to keep the status quo as it is. I don't think that any Israeli would like to have a Palestinian state inside his state, and I don't feel that the Palestinians would accept, unless forced through time, to have this. To build the one-state solution, you need a political will, which is 10 times the political will needed to do a two-state solution. And I would like to hear your reflections about this if there's time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, my name is Balashi Meshi. I'm a student at the Vienna University of Economics and Business. And I would have a question especially addressed to Mr. Swoboda. What is the way forward for the EU's common foreign and security policy concerning this issue? Knowing that certain countries such as Sweden have already recognized the Palestinian state, whereas others haven't. So can we have a real common foreign policy concerning the Israeli-Palestinian issue or not? And I know there has been another similar issue, the issue of Kosovo, where there are still countries in the EU that haven't recognized it as a state, and whether you think we could compare the two issues or not. Thank you.
Actually, it's two questions, very short one. Given what we've heard so far and what I've heard from your discussions and your inputs and discussing with Tariq later, giving the lack, excuse me but just this is my interpretation, giving the lack of political organization right now and let's say being also a bit tired of resistance, I would have two questions which appear maybe to be a little bit banal, but at the same time I guess the potential answers are quite complex and must result in a like a long process. But the questions would be how to repoliticize people, the Palestinian people, for struggles, for resistance, and not only Palestinian people, but also like the representatives, the civil societies, and of course the civil societies which have been neoliberalized, internationalized, and which will lead to democratization of the institutes, of the institutional levels, of the political representations. Yeah.
Thank you very much. You just jump in and answer a question when you feel like it, when you have an idea, I would say, to the panelists.
The question of the refugees. I think the refugees are the essence of the Palestinian problem, as you know, and it's the essence of the conflict in a certain way. I mean, and they were the dynamo, they were the source of the Palestinian revolution in 1970s. I mean, those who put the PLO on the map, those who put the Palestinians on the map, were the refugees and the sons of the refugees. But today the biggest problem with the refugees is that it's an internationally recognized right of return, but they don't have the political constituency without the revival of the PLO. It's very important to revive the PLO because this is where the place is. With the Palestinian Authority, what happened is Palestinian body politics shifted from including all the Palestinians to being concerned just with those who are in the West Bank and Gaza, and that's a very big problem at the Palestinian level and has to be resolved, and I think the only way you can resolve it is reviving the PLO and the PLO institutions, and there are many people in the diaspora, many refugees working on that, and also people within the PA working on that. Now, concerning the question of the two state, one state, and do the people want to live together, and they don't want to live together. I mean, yeah, if you go and see, any Israeli doesn't want to live with a Palestinian, and most Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza do not want to live with Israelis. But this is neither here nor there. If you asked 60 years ago, 70 years ago, if Germans wanted to live with some French, or the French wanted to live with some German, no. So it's of course, when there is conflict and there is injustice and there is fear, people do not want to live together and do not want to see each other. So your question is pertinent insofar as it tackles the fundamentals of the power inequality and how do we adjust this power inequality. But insofar as the Palestinian state is concerned, I think by now we should be in agreement that everybody recognizes the Palestinian state. I mean, what more do we want? I mean, we got a position at the UN. Of course, we are not a full state member because of some legality, but de facto, everybody recognizes that there is something called Palestinian have sovereignty, have a right to self-determination, and they have a state. But the state that the Palestinians have today is a state that doesn't have sovereignty, territorial sovereignty. Will this change by forcing Israel to retreat from the West Bank and Gaza? Maybe. But for that to happen, for the settlements to be reversible, for the wall to be dismantled, you need the political will in Israel to make it move. Algeria was much harder Algeria was than the West Bank. But in Algeria happened because you had de Gaulle and because you were at a historical juncture in which national movements were accepted as resistance movement, not as terrorist organization. Now we are in a different international configuration where people are no longer talking about I want a state, I want rights. And the function of a state, when we thought in the 20th century, the function of the state is to protect citizens. Today, in the Middle East region, what we're seeing is that the state is oppressing its citizen, is not liberating its citizen. I mean, what is the Palestinian refugee problem today compared to the Syrian refugee problem? I mean, this is a major problem. The whole region is redefining and re-challenging the concept of state power, state responsibility, and citizens' right. And I think that's something that forces us to think outside the box. This doesn't mean that states are going to vanish. States are important. But let's see things for what they are. What we have today is official recognition of two-state solution, but a reality of a one-state apartheid structure. Even Ehud Olmert admitted we are creating an apartheid system in Israel. So how do we get out of this impasse? I do not think you can get out of this impasse without political power, political will, to rebalance or to hold Israel accountable to international law. Does this happen by Palestinians claiming more and more we are a Palestinian state? No, I don't think so, because more than what we got I don't think we can get more than that. There is no state that is as we recognize by 139 states. Okay, so the legitimacy of the concept of a Palestinian state is there. What we lack is the will to implement it. And we cannot address that because of the big challenge of Israel's fears and Israel's conception of it needs to be a Jewish state. And giving a free hand for Israel to be a Jewish state, this is something problematic. Problematic especially for Europe. You went through that experience. Each state is on it to define how it wants to be, but it is not on it to define for others how they should be. So, you know, do you accept a state that is discriminating towards other citizens because they're not Jewish? That's problematic from a democratic point of view. It is accepted in fascist states, but not in a democratic society. So I think these are difficult questions. I don't undermine the fear that Israelis have. I don't undermine the antagonism that there is between the two sides. And I mean, and I tell you honestly, many people are supportive of a one-state solution until they get into Ben Gurion Airport. You get into Ben Gurion Airport, every one-stater becomes no-staters. But this is neither here nor there. What is clear, though, is that you cannot talk about two legal systems. You cannot talk about two systems of rights. Either everybody is equal, or otherwise we are in an oppressive situation that needs to be resisted. I think I'll leave it at that.
Okay, we have some more questions here that were asked. For instance, why is the EU Parliament not forcing Israel to declare the origin of its export products? That was directed to Dr. Swoboda.
We'll also come back to what Leila said, but first of all, well, the European Parliament has a very clear position on the export from the occupied areas, and it blocked a lot of agreements already with Israel because Israel was not ready to do it. And the European Parliament is relatively the most progressive one in concerning the Israel-Palestine question, but it's always a question of majority. The Parliament is not an authority, it's a parliament where you have a majority, and the majority very often of conservative also people, but nevertheless, if there's one European institution which is going forward in some way in representing the interest of Palestinians, it's European Parliament, but you have also Israel lobby there from people who have another conviction as member of European Parliament. And that comes back also to the other question about the way forward. Of course, I'm not so optimistic about the recognition of Palestine because I think that it's not yet done. I mean, yes, of course, the factor, many elements are here, but it's not on an equal footing. And therefore, I think I would be for it. And if I wrote together with our former foreign minister and a young colleague to the Austrian foreign minister to make a formal recognition, and I got a negative answer in the sense of, yes, it's possible, but we want to do it at the end. But you didn't do it with Israel at the end. In 1947, the decision was taken to have two states. And you did not wait for the recognition of Israel until you have two states. You recognized Israel, but you still don't recognize formally the Palestinian state. So I think that's totally unequal. Of course it would be good, and I'm very happy about many parliaments' decision, also European Parliament, happy about what Sweden did. And we have to go on in that way, but we need the majority to do it because still people are afraid. Now the position now is much better than perhaps 10 or 15 years ago, but it's still lacking a strong push. And if we see how the new leadership in the Congress, Foreign Affairs Committee and so on in the Senate is going after that election, it will be a horrible situation with the US. Because Obama is extremely criticized, and the pro-Israeli, partly Israeli evangelical association and combination and coalition in the United States is much stronger now. So that will be a hard fight, and I hope that Europe will stick to at least to its position it has, and against the US, and the US will not be helpful. And we don't know who will be the new president. Obama is not really fighting every day for the Palestinian right, but at least there's some hesitation. And you see what the Republicans did. They invited Netanyahu into the election campaign against Obama. It's not they invite him as such, specifically against Obama. Briefly to two other situations. Well, the one, I wasn't speaking for one state solution. I was speaking for some sort of a federation. But whatever it is, dear colleague from the Egyptian embassy, if it just go on, it will not work. Of course, you can change land. But why does Israel settle again and again? Because they are not so interested in changing land. Or they are occupying so much land, there's nothing to change and to swap, because there's nothing else here. So I think one has to tell them also the difference. And now in Israel, of course, you have already a president who thinks about one state. At least he's fighting for some basic rights for Palestinians in Israel, not the prime minister and some of his colleagues. You have to find new ways. And I think, of course, finally, you can also make a referendum, perhaps, with the Palestinians, what they do accept. But everybody has to know what is the alternative. The alternative is to go on like that. And that is not, I think, if you see the young people blocked at the checkpoints and how they are treated and many other issues, I think it's not acceptable anymore. And one has to tell also the Israelis, Mr. Netanyahu invited French Jews to come back to Israel because they are secure there. How many Israelis are dying in Israel because of insecurity? Because it's not the mistake of the others, it's the mistake of the Israeli government, because the policy of Israel's government is not one for security for the Israelis. So I think we have to again and again show this kind of discrepancy. And the last point on the refugees, which shows that even on the refugee issue, we have to think in a broader context, as you said already. Do you think all the refugees can come back to Israel? I don't think. Do you think all the refugees can go back have to go to Palestine? It's an enormous job. Now, I know that it's difficult, especially in Lebanon, because of the balance of power there. But in some way, we have to involve Lebanon and Jordan, at least, in a solution for the refugees. And, of course, Israel has to take certain responsibility, and Palestine as well. But you cannot say that the refugee problem only can be solved by Israel and Palestine if you don't involve the others. It's not an easy game. It will be difficult. And as long as we have, let's be honest also to see it in a broader perspective, this kind of fight between the Sunnis and the Shia, that means especially between Saudi Arabia and Iran, in that area it will be very difficult, because everybody is afraid that the other is winning. And therefore I'm also thinking, pushing, or also my visit as a group leader to Iran, which was not seen by everybody well, we have to bring Iran into the game. Not because I love this kind of regime, but I don't love the regime in Saudi Arabia either. But you have to come back in a situation where not everybody is fighting against everybody. Iran and Saudi Arabia has to see that this kind of fight is only benefiting the extremists. Of course, and the European and especially US intervention. If you put these things together, it's not surprising that we have IS. And therefore, I think we have to have, in the broader sense, because you asked me about the European, in a broader sense, we have another issue. I think one of the most important elements of the foreign and security policy and of the High Representative, the former High Representative, has been to stick to the Iran case and try to find a solution. Not easy with the Americans and not easy especially with the Republicans. Now we even want more sanctions. But if we don't bring in Israel, if we don't have a basic agreement between Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt as the big powers there, it doesn't work. I'm not happy about the quarrel between Turkey and Egypt. And I think one should try, and I'm not happy about everything which has happened in Egypt, but you have to have some sort of a readiness of the countries to look beyond what they normally represented in the past. Because otherwise, they will be the first victim. Because as bad as it was, the killing in Paris and any other kind, most people die, the Muslim terrorism, so-called Islamist terrorists, the victims are the Muslims themselves. And you in the region are the victims. There are enough people killed in the region every day. And it has to come forward an alternative way of thinking. If you continue the way as you do, and as we do, and especially the Americans do, the killing will go on. But that is not what we are here for.
Thank you. I'd like to just ask Mazen now on the fifth question. How to repoliticize the Palestinians for struggle and solidarity and things that have been destroyed by Israel and neoliberalism?
So I got the hard question.
Very easy.
And I'm saying it's hard because the four of us today over breakfast were discussing that question exactly. And none of us had answers. So one thing to start with is to actually acknowledge what are the reasons for depoliticization and the problems of the existing economic situation. And to try to think about what could be changed based on that. But the problem also is not just an issue of depoliticization and neoliberalism, but also it extends to many institutions and also a kind of mentality that developed in post-Oslo in the West Bank. And this mentality is also reflected, and probably one of the ways of the reasons it became so prominent is that you can see it in the policies, you can see it in education, you can see it in educational materials, in people's ways of thinking. And one way to deal with it, for example, is to change the priorities of the Palestinian Authority, for example. Now, 35% of the GDP, of the budget of the Palestinian Authority is spent on security. Now, that's for an entity which is not a state, does not have borders, does not have an army. It's not that we can say that they have a fleet that they have to maintain, so they need to spend that much money on it. It's spent basically to keep Palestinians in check and to protect Israel's security. So, and compare this to the amount or the percentage that's spent on education, the amount that's spent on healthcare, on development. So one of the things that we also were discussing in the morning was the prospects of finding academic jobs in Palestine, for example. So one of the things to begin with is to put pressure on the Palestinian Authority to do that, and probably Europe can play a role in that, because at the end of the day, you guys are paying for this security apparatus. It's not that the taxes that are levied by the Palestinians. It's mostly money from the donors. So I think that's probably one way to deal with it. But I think also the other speakers will have a lot to say about this issue, especially that it seems that they have engaged with it also more.
I mean, in this regard, I just would like to say two things. One, with regards to your point about the state, the Palestinian state. What I meant is that even if tomorrow the EU recognizes the Palestinian state, even if the Americans pass a resolution in the Security Council, which I doubt, but even if we imagine they pass a resolution in the Security Council admitting the existence of a state of Palestine with the borders of 1974, do you see that Israel will retreat from the West Bank?
You're
no.
right.
That's what I meant. More than this, is the reason why they're not the EU is not doing it is for diplomatic reason, not because they think it's not feasible. So that's what I meant. I meant more is that we lack the political will to actually implement a two-state solution because, as you rightly said, Israel is not interested in it. And as actually Israel is interested in saying we have a Palestinian state by name, but de facto Israel is the dominant power from the river to the sea. Now the question of political mobilization and repoliticization of the Palestinian. I think this is a question that is very important, is very worrisome because the Palestinians had a history of incredible political activism and pluralism. And what we've seen with Oslo is the diminishing political sphere. I mean, every Arabic country, I mean, I had Syrian friends, they used to tell me, we're so envious you're Palestinian because you go out in the street and you demonstrate, whereas we could not against Assad or against Mubarak or against, you know. And I think what happened over the past 20 years has been the creation of the repressive state. So what we have in Palestine, we have a security state like most Arab states. And with what has happened with the Arab Spring and the answer to the Arab Spring and the disintegration of the state in Iraq or in Syria, or we don't know exactly where it's going, and the role of Saudi Arabia and all that, I think this question of repoliticization is linked to the region. And it's linked also to how the discourse, the language of politics is changing. You have incredible grassroots activism. You have incredible way by which people are saying, we do politics. We let politics just for the corrupt people. We are doing politics on the ground, on the grassroots, on the day-to-day. And we see it also in the activism for Palestine, for example, the whole mobilization against the wall. This is a mobilization which is political, but it doesn't have a political party. But you have people in Nalin, Bil'ain, weekly demonstrations which actually give you the genesis of how could a federated system look like, because these manifestation, demonstration have always Palestinians, Israelis, and international community in it. So there is form of different political activism. The question is, one, will it coalesce towards political parties? And this is a problem that concerns the whole world. In the 21st century, we did not find an answer. How can you do politics without political parties? And how can you have political parties without them being corrupt? And the answer to how you can have political party without being corrupt is to have strong democratic institutions. That's the only answer we have. You know? So that's what we need to be working on. And that's, for it to be viable, is the grassroots, is people saying, you know what, I want my right. I don't care who is in power, but you have no right to take away, to put me in prison because I express my opinion. You have no right to kick me out of my house because I am not from your faction. You have no right to have clear constitutional institution. I think it's happening, but we're living now a very dark age. I personally compare what's happening in the Middle East like in Europe, the Second World War. I mean, that's how I see it. Now, for how long, I don't know, but I very much agree with you. You need to bring in Iran, and you need to bring in, the whole region needs to have this larger Turkey, a larger discussion, and larger. But we need Europe in that respect to help uphold human rights and political rights of everybody. Yeah, no, that's okay.
My question would be, continuing the thought what the European Union could do, not just the parliament, but all bodies of the union, those with teeth, no offense to the parliamentaries, but I mean the Commission and the Council, imagining that there would be that there would be a common agenda towards peace, and they want to set a policy mix. What should they do to incentivize the Israelis, the Palestinians, to work together for a solution, and taking also in some element of keeping of other political groups, players in the region who want to influence that in a, let's say, way that wouldn't benefit the people of Palestine, saying Hezbollah in Lebanon, to keep them maybe off. And also bringing them to the table, like the Saudis, the Iranians. How could a policy mix look from the European side, thinking that they want it, not like, let's say there is some kind of veto from some country if they want it.
Thank you.
My question is to Mr. Swoboda. and it's in effect a repeat of a question which I had to one of the previous panels. It's based on an observation. Probably in March, there are going to be 12 members, Arabs, of the Israeli Knesset. They always were members in the Israeli Knesset. The issue is that for years, until last year, they never participated in an actual political voting. Last year, they came down, and Rivlin is now president of Israel based on Arab votes. Quite serious. Now, imagine in March that in order to have a majority, those that are trying to dislodge Mr. Netanyahu could actually do this on the basis of Arab votes in order to achieve the majority. This is something that is in the cards, and 2 months from now we could read in the papers that this is a possibility. What do you think, how could Europe encourage the Arabs of the Knesset to vote? And how to see this as the beginning of a one-state solution in slow moves, starting with something far from the ideal that those members that are Arabs of the Israeli Knesset will obtain from the new government.
Thank you. Let's conceive this two-state solution. Do you think that those two different people will ever tolerate themselves, and that the borders will stay the same as they are then dedicated to be? And do you think that the conflicts at the borders will stop, and that the army of country A doesn't feel provoked by any action from the other army? Maybe you could answer that. I know that's difficult to answer, but some ideas maybe. Thank you.
I'm the ambassador of Jordan in Vienna. Sam Husseini is my name. I would like to thank you so much for this interesting debate. I'd like to claim that I really believe that whatever has been said can really help us to get through to some solution. But what I'm seeing is that after 20 years since this Oslo process started, since the whole serious process of the peace process in the Middle East started, after 20 years, I think we have exhausted everything. We have exhausted all our possibilities. We have tried all channels, all ways of convincing ourselves that things can be done in the way we're thinking it is. We are trying to avoid the direct and shortcut to the solution. Something that has been mentioned by the respective speakers tonight, which is the political will. But we are still insisting not to understand that the political will should be on both sides. One, on the Israeli side, on one side, and the second one is on the international community. Simply because of what we have seen through the last 20 years, is that nothing can change the political will in Israel. Nobody could change the political will in Israel except the Israelis themselves. So what is need to be addressed here is how can we create, or how can we push this Israeli political will to make things on the right track. And for that, we need the political will of the international community, because they have the moral and legal obligation and responsibility for what's happening there. I'm saying here because I want to take the words of experts here, that unless the Israeli individual feels really that the cost of occupation is so high, the cost of what they are doing on the Palestinians, on the Palestinian lands, is so high, until then they will not realize that they have to settle down and they have to accept to give the Palestinians their rights. Because every time an Israeli confiscates a land of the Palestinians, every time an Israeli makes any crime against the Palestinians on their land, they go away with it. They've never been brought to justice, as they should. And none of the Palestinians have ever able to return one of their land which has been confiscated. And that's why the chances are slim to have these two-state solutions. Unless this takes place, unless the international community start to act with responsibility, I'm talking here on the human rights, for example. You have Article 2 of the association agreement between the EU and Israel. What did the EU do on this article, on the implementation of this article? How much are you acting enough on the crimes of the occupation itself, on the crime of the settlements itself? All of these are crimes and have to have some legal consequences on the individual, not on the state, on the individuals who are involved and who are engaged in those crimes. Unless we do that, until the individuals in Israel feel the heat of what they are doing and the crimes that they are doing, until then, they will never start to act with responsibility, and they will never start to feel that they should stop and should reconcile with the Palestinians. This is what I think, and this is what I hope, that the European Union one day could come forward in that direction. Thank you.
I would start with the two questions directly addressed to me, and we see each other in Brussels next week. You know, maybe also a brief comment to the ambassador. Yeah, we can complain. I mean, complaining is the normal business we hear in the Middle East. You are absolutely right. Why does the European Union, not me, the European Union sanction Russia for what they does, and they don't sanction Israel? Yeah, no. And then we sit the next 10 years again. If we don't think about something new, realistic, and concrete, we don't go forward. And then we're coming back to your question. Yes, I think European Union should bring in new ideas, how this new structure can be. Maybe in alternatives, as I said, one state, two state, federation, whatever, to come to new ideas and, for example, say the approach, the principal approach, equal rights for everybody living there, as the main approach to convince also many citizens also in Europe that it's unfair what is done there. You know, normal citizens in Europe have a very limited orientation, a bit more sophisticated than in the US, but still very limited. Terrorism is bad, and the Palestinians are perhaps terrorists, so it's bad. Israel is not seen as a terrorist country. Let's be honest. But you also have to look to the history of what has been done by Austrians and Germans and others. You cannot just, of course, I always say, you don't undo what we have done to the Jews by being bad to the Arab and Palestinians. But the fact is that many people have this kind of things in the back. So we have to have a new start. And a new start is a new idea there. Secondly, as I said, with Iran and others, to think about less military engagement there and more political engagement there. For example, when I went to the University of Alexandria, what did the young people want? They want to study in Europe. Why don't we help more to form a middle class in these countries who is interested in basic human rights, and of course in jobs, in democracy, as was said, in participation? This is a much better intervention, so to say, from the European side than some of the military intervention we had, or in Iraq and whatever. You know, first of all, we have to think what we should not do. We should not go into Iraq. We should not go into Libya in the way we did. You know, you go in, you bomb, and then you say, now it's your problem. No, it's not their problem. It's also our problem, because terrorism is coming back, or is going further down in Africa. So I think this engagement with all the countries concerned, and then we have to speak with Jordan and with Lebanon. What can we do, how to solve and help in the refugee problem? I mean, it's crazy. I mean, I visited one of the camps in refugee camp for the Syrian refugees now, also of course Palestinian, in Jordan. 100,000 are there. If 20,000 or 30,000 are in Europe, it's a big problem. But Jordan has already, I don't know, 1 million Palestinian, and now it gets 1 million Syrian refugees. And that's not a problem. So I think, again, Europe would have to speak with these countries concerned, how we can help in solving some of the problems of the refugees. And of course, it will be not easy if in Lebanon you still have the fight, the civil war more or less, sometimes cold, sometimes hot, between the different fractions. It's not easy to get another recognition of the Palestinians as citizens of Lebanon. But in some way we have to do all the different structures, including, of course, the economic support. I think this is the European obligation. And coming to the second very interesting question on Israel and what to do. I know Bushe Herzog since some time. I think he is serious. He wants to do something. Of course, with all the limitations, not the most courageous one for all the solutions. I know Tzipi Livni, who is also interested. Maybe also personal interest in power. Yes, why not? If they do the right thing. So if they go together, it's a good thing. But maybe they don't get the majority. I fear they don't get it. I would advise the Palestinians, if you go for the election, why don't you be active in the parliament? You can't do both, abstain and go out, but then you are elected. They have to play an important role. Maybe in a double sense, not only in the parliament, but also outside. But I think it is not possible to leave Israeli politics only to the Jewish part of Israel. They will be there for all the time. So I think it would be very good to have an active engagement also of the Palestinian deputies. And there are some people who are interested. You mentioned Rivlin, when I spoke with him the last time when he was still president of the Knesset. I mean, there was some difference, and therefore Netanyahu didn't want him to be president. Not because overall he has a more progressive policy, but at least for some basic rights in Israel he is fighting. Perhaps more than Shimon Peres. And that is one step forward. We don't get the big step. We get small steps, but that we have to push. And this is, again, what Europe should be very clear. I would like to have sanctions. I would like to have many more things on Israel. But let's be honest, we have to convince also our citizens. If our citizens are not pressing enough our foreign ministers and our people to do something more, they will not do it. Because they have many other elements. But one of these elements to show that Israel is not only the Jewish community, but also the Arabs, and that the Arabs are active and are fighting for the rights also inside, apropos politicization. It's not only about the Palestinians, it's also about the Arab population inside Israel. I think that would be an enormous step forward. In that sense, sometimes I'm optimistic, not always, but if I look at people here, what they think, it's the only chance. And if you look at Leila and you, then I think we have to be also optimistic with all the bad situation they have. Thank you very much.
The first question was what incentives can be given to Israelis and Palestinians? What policy mix, if I understood you correctly, by the EU? What incentives can be given to the Israelis and Palestinians? Yes. Can we trick the EU? Can we trick the Israelis and Palestinians into peace and mutual respect? Because the EU, after all, is powerful, is rich, is powerful, and it's Israel's main trading partner. is the EU. So it does have leverage. And now our EU expert just left, but maybe we can answer it somehow.
I think it's goes back to what was discussed earlier about the boycotts, divestments, and sanctions movement. Now, if you look at the export, the trade relationship between Europe and Israel, Europe is the main trade partner. If you look at the other kind of collaboration, for example, in research, so Israel is a member of the Horizon 2020, which is about 80 billion euros of research for 5 years, which is a lot of money. And some of this research, which is done by some Israeli universities actually, ends up helping and promoting a lot of the weapons development and arms development, arms industry. So does Europe have the political will to actually tell Israel, well, we are not going to make you part of this discussion or part of this research collaboration unless you actually uphold international law and human rights? Or at least even ask questions about where is this money going? So is this money being used to create and design missiles and design all kind of things that are going to be used against the Palestinians? Where are these universities? There was some discussion about Ariel University, which is in the settlement in the West Bank, participating in this. But at the end of the day, they reached a resolution, which is probably a showing of weakness on the part of the EU. Is that on the one hand, you're just all day you're talking about settlements, but then when you have the power and the real moment where you can actually do something about it, you don't. Which also brings me to the issue of the recognition, which is, I think there's two sides to the issue of recognition of statehood by the different parliaments. The one side is that, on the one hand, there is a clear show of sympathy to the Palestinian cause. On the other hand, it might be the easy way out for many of these countries and parliaments. Now, many of these countries' parliaments made resolutions, but the governments did not. So, which is not really does not have any effect internationally. But if you see, there's in the past few years we had the issue of Palestinian statehood and recognition, and in parallel there was the issue of boycotts, divestment, and sanctions, with many people in different countries in the world pushing for that. So, in some sense, what I'm worried about is that the recognition, which at the end of the day could take you only to a limited distance, because it doesn't really have any teeth, it doesn't really have any operative aspects, is kind of in a way of like, okay, we did something about it, which does not really cost us anything, really. All it did cost was probably the Israeli ambassador complaining about it, as a way of probably delaying implementing more serious actions that actually will hurt the economy. So this is the way I look at this trend of recognition.
So just to quieten the Palestinian voice of protest in these countries.
Yeah, and basically, yes, it's just we're doing something about it, and we'll see what happens, and let's wait 2-3 years and milk this decision till the end, and then afterwards we'll start talking about more operative measures that could be taken that will actually have results. That's why I actually think the whole push for statehood on the part of the PA was probably not really the wisest step. Especially that at the end of the day, even if the whole world says, well, okay, we recognize it's a state, and it's not a state, then it's not a state. It's like, all of you say that I'm Superman, but I'm not. I can't fly. But on the other hand, it's become easier to put obligations also on the state. So it could be that you have all of the obligations and responsibilities of the state, but none of the powers, which is probably the current situation today.
Leila?
I think in this respect, something very important that you said is the parallels, as I said, with South Africa is very important. People don't like it because Israel doesn't think of itself as an apartheid state. I do believe that Israel never wanted to create an apartheid reality because Israel wanted to get rid of the Palestinian, did not want to use the Palestinian, but de facto it created an apartheid reality. The big problem, though, the big difference is also in South Africa. The solution that white supremacists offered to the blacks was a two-state solution. They said, you, African, you constitute a different nation, you are Bantu, and we're going to give you a state, we're going to give you a homeland. And they gave it a homeland, and they declared them independent already in 1972. Transkei was an independent state in 1972. And it actually, even the South Africa at the time, South African government, tried to get the Transkei accepted into the UN as an independent nation, as an independent state. And at the time it did not work because the international community said the apartheid system is an illegal system. The ANC said, we don't want this farce because this is not a state, it is deprived of real sovereignty. It's not going to be recognized. And the UN refused to recognize it as a state, although an application was submitted. Now, in the Palestinian context, what is very tragic is that the Palestinian state have international recognition of their state. But the problem, the more you go with this, you're actually legalizing a Bantustan, rather than saying this is a Bantustan. A beautiful example, this is not a Superman, this is a mini entity, which is not a state. I think that's the big problem. And so it comes to your question about, will the Palestinian and the Israeli want to live together? They don't like each other. Of course they don't like each other. I mean, the whole discourse in Israel is that the Palestinians are terrorists, they're not human beings. That Hamas is a terrorist organization, not people under siege by Israel, under war, 4 wars in 8 years. This is not what the discourse is Israeli here. And the Palestinians, they never get a chance to see an Israeli who's not a soldier. So how would they like to live with each other? It's totally understandable that they want to live with each other. But also in South Africa, do you think the white South Africans were very happy to live with the blacks? I mean, South African white up until the 1980s believed, no, the black Africans should be just happy that they're living in South Africa and they have jobs. They don't like it, let them go to Mozambique. Let them try Botswana. They are better off with us than what the Israelis are saying. They're better off with us than with somebody else. So nobody gives privileges. Privileges get taken away from you, okay, if you want to survive in the long run. So I think the question again, as there is the step-by-step process that you need to work at more than one level, but there is also some certain fundamental rights that have to be upheld. And I think the EU has an important role to play in that regard. Now, what will make Israel shift? Just pressure. Nothing but pressure. And pressure can be non-violent, but has to be pressure. And in that respect, BDS is a very effective strategy that can play at more than one level. We have various tools. What is missing is enough political will. And I think the lack of political will comes from the fact that the configuration in the region has changed. People now, Saudi Arabia believes that Iran is a bigger problem than Israel. This is a big problem. This is a big problem. 20 years ago, Saudi Arabia did not say something like that. So I think the Palestinian problem has always been dependent on the regional configuration, and the regional configuration has also depended on the Palestinian fate. We are at a turning point. It's still going to get ugly, unfortunately. But one thing is clear from the way people are talking in the region, they will not tolerate oppressive countries for much longer. The demographic pressure, people will accept oppression if they can have economic prosperity. But economic oppression and economic decay will not go together. And Saudi Arabia has enough money, but also has a very large population. And I mean, I don't know. I don't think the situation can survive much longer without some change on the ground. But there are many pieces to the puzzle, and everyone has to do his piece. And eventually the puzzle will come together. This is my optimism, at least.